Before we dive deeper into these chilling tales, I want to take a moment to connect with you, my listeners. Wherever you're tuning in from, whether it's a cozy living room, your car on a late-night drive, or your bed with the covers pulled up, I want you to drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. It's incredible to think that while we're all in different places, experiencing life in our own unique ways, we're here together, sharing this moment. Stories have this beautiful way of reminding us that even though our lives may seem so different, we're more alike than we realize. So let's connect. Tell me where you're from, and let's show that no matter where we are in the world, we all share the same curiosity for the unknown. We're not so different after all. It started as a routine road trip through the Midwest, a chance for 24-year-old Emma to escape the grind of her 9-to-5 job. Armed with her playlist, snacks, and a well-worn map, she hit the road, hoping to rediscover a sense of freedom. She planned to take back roads, exploring small towns and forgotten places, but she never expected to find a town that wasn't on the map. On her second day of travel, her car GPS inexplicably glitched, leaving her on an unfamiliar road. Cell service was spotty, and her map didn't list the area. As the sun dipped lower, Emma grew uneasy. Vast fields stretched out endlessly, and the occasional farmhouse seemed abandoned. Finally, she saw a sign. "Welcome to Elkridge." The sign was old, the paint peeling, but the sight of civilization relieved her. She drove through the small, quiet town. It was picturesque at first glance, with old brick buildings, a charming main street, and a clock tower that chimed faintly in the distance. Yet something felt off. There were no people. Emma parked and got out to investigate. The air was still, eerily so. Doors were slightly ajar, chairs and tables sat as though someone had just left, and a light breeze carried the faint smell of something metallic. She called out, "Hello!" But her voice seemed swallowed by the quiet. She wandered into a diner. Plates of food sat on tables untouched but perfectly preserved. Coffee cups still steamed as if they had been poured minutes ago. A newspaper lay open at the counter. The date read, July 12th, 1956. Panic set in as Emma realized that every clock in the diner was frozen at 3:17 p.m. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She hurried out, her footsteps echoing unnaturally against the sidewalk. In her car, she tried her phone again. Still no signal. The clock on her dashboard now read 3:17, despite her leaving the diner an hour earlier. Her hands trembled as she started the engine, but it sputtered and died. Emma was stranded. Determined to find help, she decided to head toward the clock tower, thinking it might hold answers. The street seemed to change as she walked. What had been a straight road now twisted into a maze. Shadows stretched long and dark, even though the sun hadn't moved. As she approached the tower, she noticed something strange, the sound of footsteps behind her. Emma turned, but no one was there. She quickened her pace, the footsteps following suit. By the time she reached the clock tower, her heart was racing. She pushed open its heavy wooden door and stepped inside. Dusty gears and chains filled the cavernous space, their metallic smell overpowering. At the center of the room stood a single wooden chair, its back to her. A faint humming sound filled the air. Slowly, she circled the chair, dreading what she might see. The chair was empty, but tied to it was a photograph. A picture of Emma, taken from behind, standing in the diner just moments earlier. Her breath caught as the humming grew louder. The gears of the clock began to turn, grinding as if waking after decades of silence. The hands on the clock moved backward, faster and faster. Emma's surroundings blurred and she felt her body pulled, as if by an invisible current. When the sensation stopped, she was no longer in the clock tower. She was standing in the middle of the diner again. But this time, it wasn't empty. The people of Elkridge were there, seated at the tables. They were frozen in place, their faces blank, eyes staring straight ahead. Slowly, their heads began to turn toward her, one by one, until every gaze was fixed on Emma. A man in a suit, his face unnaturally pale, stood up and walked toward her. His voice was calm, but hollow. "Welcome, newcomer. You'll get used to it soon enough." Emma bolted for the door, her heart pounding. Outside, the town was alive but wrong. People moved like marionettes, their motions jerky and mechanical. The clock tower loomed, its hands spinning wildly. She ran to her car, desperate to escape. Her car now started effortlessly. She floored Imayat, the tires squealing as she sped out of Elkridge. The sign that welcomed her was gone. In its place was another sign. "Thanks for visiting." Hours later, Emma found herself on a familiar highway. Relief flooded her as she re-entered the world of gas stations and rest stops. Yet her unease lingered. She stopped at a motel for the night, locking the door and double-checking the windows. For the first time, she felt safe, until she saw the clock on the nightstand. It read 3:17. It began as an internet dare. Brian and his 3 friends, Jess, Danny, and Heather, were road tripping through rural Pennsylvania when they came across a Reddit thread about local urban legends. The one that caught their attention was the Watcher's Bridge, a decrepit, forgotten stone bridge deep in the woods, where it was said anyone who crossed after midnight would disappear. It sounded like the perfect mix of creepy and fun. Jess, always the skeptic, rolled her eyes, but Danny egged everyone on. Heather read aloud from her phone. The Watcher was a man who lived by the bridge in the 1800s, a recluse who supposedly practiced black magic. When he was caught kidnapping locals, a mob lynched him, leaving his body hanging over the water. Legend says his spirit stayed behind, watching for anyone foolish enough to disturb his resting place. Brian laughed it off. "So what? We walk over a creepy bridge and get watched? Big deal." That night they turned off the main road, the GPS guiding them to a narrow dirt path. The trees crowded closer the deeper they drove, their branches clawing at the car's windows. Jess had her camera ready, joking about filming the Watcher for TikTok. Eventually they came to a rusted metal gate, partially open. Beyond it was the bridge, bathed in pale moonlight. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and moss. The bridge looked ancient, its stones cracked and weathered, overgrown with vines. A faint mist clung to the surface, swirling unnaturally as the group approached. Heather hesitated. "This feels wrong." Danny rolled his eyes. "It's a bridge, not a portal to hell." "Are we sure about that?" Jess muttered, snapping pictures. Brian, trying to seem fearless, stepped onto the bridge first. The air grew colder still, and the silence became oppressive, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. One by one, the others followed, their footsteps echoing against the stone. Halfway across, Brian stopped and turned to the others. "See? Nothing's—" A sudden noise cut him off. A low, guttural groan, like the bridge itself was breathing. The mist thickened, curling around their ankles. Danny waved his phone flashlight around, trying to pierce the fog, but it only seemed to reflect back at him. "That's enough for me," Heather said, already turning back toward the car. But the way back was gone. Where the car had been was now an impenetrable wall of trees. The bridge stretched endlessly in both directions, dissolving into the mist. Jess gasped, gripping Brian's arm. This isn't real." Danny's laugh was strained. "Okay, good trick. Whoever's pranking us, you got us. Come out." His voice echoed, unnaturally distorted, like it was coming from underwater. Heather tried calling out, her voice cracking with panic, but the mist swallowed her words. Then came the sound of footsteps. slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. They turned toward the noise, but there was nothing there. The mist shifted, parting slightly to reveal faint impressions on the stone, as if invisible feet were moving toward them. Heather screamed and stumbled backward, her foot catching on a loose stone. Brian grabbed her just in time, but the motion sent his phone tumbling over the edge. It vanished into the blackness below. No splash, no sound. "What the hell is this?" Jess whispered, her voice trembling. A figure emerged from the mist. At first, it seemed like a shadow, a trick of the light. But as it moved closer, its form became unmistakable. A man in tattered, old-fashioned clothing, his face obscured by a burlap sack tied tightly around his head. The sack was stained dark, as if with dried blood. His movements were jerky, like a puppet on frayed strings. The Watcher. Danny bolted, running down the length of the bridge, but he never seemed to get farther away. The others yelled for him to stop, but he didn't. The Watcher tilted his head as if amused, then vanished into the mist. Danny's screams followed seconds later. Brian, Jess, and Heather were frozen in place, their breaths shallow and ragged. Heather whispered, "We need to go. Now." They turned to head the way they came, but the bridge seemed different, longer, darker, with no end in sight. The mist closed in around them, carrying with it faint whispers, just at the edge of comprehension. Brian strained to listen, but the words dissolved like smoke the moment he tried to grasp them. Jess clutched her camera like a lifeline. "I don't know what this is, but we're getting out of here." She began snapping pictures, the flash cutting through the gloom. Each photo revealed more of the bridge, details they couldn't see with their eyes alone. On the stones were carvings, strange symbols and runes that pulsed faintly with a sickly green light. In the next flash, the Watcher was standing right behind Heather. She didn't scream. She didn't even move. Her eyes glazed over, her body stiff as the Watcher's hand reached toward her. Brian lunged forward, pulling her away just in time. The Watcher's sack-covered head tilted again as if amused before he disappeared once more. Heather blinked, disoriented. I felt cold, like ice in my veins. Brian tightened his grip on her hand. "We're not splitting up. Stay close." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Jess's camera clicked again, capturing an image that made her drop the device in horror. She didn't explain, just started running, dragging the others with her. The bridge began to change. The stones shifted beneath their feet, cracking and groaning. Hands emerged from the gaps. Pale, skeletal hands, clawing at their legs, their clothes. The mist churned violently, and the whispers became a deafening cacophony. Ahead, a faint light appeared, a way out. "Run!" Brian shouted. They sprinted toward the light, dodging the grasping hands and the Watcher's sudden appearances. Each time he materialized, he was closer, faster, his movements more fluid and human-like. By the time they reached the light, they were gasping for air, their bodies trembling. They emerged into the forest, the bridge nowhere in sight. The air was still and quiet, the mist gone. But something wasn't right. Heather pointed at Jess's camera, now dangling from her neck. The screen was cracked, but it still displayed the last photo she had taken, an image of the three of them running across the bridge. And behind them, the Watcher was smiling. They didn't see him smile before. They weren't sure who had taken the picture. It began with a knock at the door, not the kind you hear in the safety of your home, but a knock that echoed through the dead silence of the forest, miles from civilization. Lila had been living off the grid for 3 months. After a brutal divorce and the loss of her high-stress marketing job, she had packed her things and left the city behind. The cabin was her refuge, nestled deep in the Appalachian wilderness. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just trees, wildlife, and the occasional letter delivered to the post box a mile down the trail. She never regretted the decision. Until now. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps, hollow and deliberate, against the heavy oak door. Lila froze, her heart pounding. It was 2:17 a.m. She hadn't seen another human in weeks, and the nearest neighbor was a good 2-hour hike. She grabbed the flashlight from the counter and tiptoed to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. "Hello?" she called, her voice wavering. No response. "Who's there?" She tried again. Only the wind answered, whistling through She peered through the peephole, her breath fogging the cold metal. Nothing but darkness stretched before her. She decided it was her imagination until the knock came again, louder this time, as if the visitor were impatient. She held her breath and slowly unlatched the door, her flashlight trembling as she opened it, just a crack. The beam cut through the night, illuminating nothing. The porch was empty, the forest beyond undisturbed. She stepped outside, scanning the tree line. "Is someone out there? I have a gun." That was a lie. Her grandfather's old hunting rifle sat unloaded above the mantel. Silence. Lila waited, feeling exposed under the full moon. Then faintly she heard it. A voice. Distant, low and muffled, as if coming from deep within the woods. "Help me!" Her blood ran cold. It was a man's voice, weak and strained. Against her better judgment, she took a few steps toward the sound, shining her flashlight into the dense trees. "Who's there? Are you hurt?" she called out. "Help! Me!" The voice was clearer now, coming from deeper in the woods. Lila hesitated. She knew the forest well enough to navigate it in daylight, but venturing out at night was risky. The ground was uneven, the trails easily lost. Yet something about the voice tugged at her, a desperation that felt too real to ignore. She grabbed her coat, a lantern, and the hunting rifle, just in case, before stepping off the porch. The cold bit at her cheeks as she followed the sound, the beam of her flashlight bouncing ahead of her. The voice led her deeper and deeper into the woods. The further she went, the stranger it became. The man's pleas would grow louder, then softer, as if he were circling her. Sometimes it sounded like he was just ahead, other times behind. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. "Where are you?" she shouted, frustration creeping into her voice. "Help! Me!" Finally, she reached a clearing. Her flashlight illuminated a crumbling stone well in the center, its edges overgrown with moss. The voice seemed to emanate from within. "Are you down there?" Lila approached cautiously, peering into the darkness of the well. She could see nothing, but the voice echoed up to her, chilling in its clarity. "Please help." She lowered the flashlight, but its beam couldn't reach the bottom. The air around the well was unnaturally cold, and the scent of damp earth and decay made her stomach turn. "I'm calling for help!" she shouted. The voice was silent for a moment, and then it came again, more urgent this time. "Don't leave, please. They'll come back." Lila's breath caught. Who will come back?" Before the voice could answer, a low growl rumbled from the forest behind her. She spun around, the flashlight jerking wildly. The beam landed on a pair of eyes, glowing yellow in the darkness. A massive shape emerged from the shadows, a creature unlike anything Lila had ever seen. It was vaguely wolf-like, but its limbs were too long, its body impossibly thin, its movements disturbingly unnatural. The growl deepened as the creature crept closer, its eyes fixed on her. Lila raised the rifle, her hands shaking. "Stay back!" she screamed. The creature bared its teeth, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. Lila stumbled back, her heel catching on the well's edge. She barely caught herself from falling in. The creature lunged, and a deafening roar split the night as the rifle discharged, the recoil knocking Lila to the ground. The shot missed, but the sound startled the creature. It stopped mid-lunge, its head snapping toward the trees. For a moment it seemed to listen, then it let out a bone-chilling howl and disappeared into the forest, its limbs contorting as it moved. Lila lay on the ground, gasping for air. The well's cold stone pressed against her back, grounding her in the surreal moment. "Please," the voice came again, softer now. "They're still here." She scrambled to her feet, gripping the rifle tightly. "Who are you? What is this?" "They want you too." The forest fell silent again, but the air felt heavier, oppressive. Lila's instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't leave without answers. She shone the flashlight back into the well, trying to focus on the voice. "What's down there? Who are you?" "I was like you," the voice whispered. "Once." "What does that mean? Are you trapped?" "They'll trap you too." The voice sounded weaker now, fading. "Unless you leave now." A rustling noise came from the trees. It wasn't the growl of the creature this time. It was softer, like footsteps, multiple footsteps. Lila's heart pounded as shadows began to move between the trees, too many to count. Eyes glinted in the darkness, reflecting her flashlight like tiny mirrors. "They're here," the voice said, barely audible. Lila didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, her flashlight bobbing wildly. The shadows pursued, their movements impossibly fast, their footsteps growing louder. When she finally broke through the trees and into the clearing where her cabin stood, she didn't stop running. She bolted up the porch steps, slammed the door behind her, and locked it. Her chest heaved as she pressed her back against the wood, clutching the rifle. Silence. Then, faintly, the knock came again. 3 sharp raps, just like before. But this time it wasn't at the door. It came from the window. Lila turned slowly, her blood turning to ice as she saw the silhouette standing just outside. It wasn't a man. It wasn't even human. And it was watching her. Lila stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it echo in her ears. The figure outside the window was obscured by shadow, its features too twisted to comprehend. Yet its presence radiated something primal, something utterly wrong. Slowly it raised a hand and tapped the glass with a single elongated finger. Tap, tap, tap. "Leave me alone," she screamed, aiming the rifle at the window. Her hands shook so violently she could barely keep the barrel steady. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, and then its voice came. It wasn't a growl or a roar, but a perfect imitation of her own. "Leave me alone." The words sent a jolt through Sar. But before she could process what she'd heard, the figure shifted. It seemed to dissolve into the darkness, its form seeping into the shadows like smoke. The cabin grew oppressively quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of waiting, of dread. Then the knocking came again, this time from the back door. Lila spun around, every nerve in her body on fire. She backed into the center of the room, keeping her eyes darting between the doors and windows. The knocks grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was outside was trying to break in. But it wasn't just one knock anymore. It was coming from all around, Walls, windows, the ceiling, and then, impossibly, the floor. The voice returned, soft and mocking. "Let me in." "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She aimed the rifle at the floorboards, her finger hovering over the trigger. "Get out of here! Leave me alone!" The knocking stopped. Silence fell again, but it wasn't the silence of relief. It was the silence of a trap being set. Lila's flashlight flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. Panic surged through her as she fumbled with the lantern. On the counter, her fingers trembling, when she finally managed to light it, the glow cast long, dancing shadows across the walls. The knocking resumed, softer this time, accompanied by whispers. "Lila, you belong here." Her name, over and over, from voices she didn't recognize. Male, female, young, old. It was a chorus of strangers, all calling her name, all coming closer. She clutched the lantern and the rifle, her breath ragged. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the cabin like a storm. And then she realized they weren't just outside anymore. They were inside. Lila screamed as the shadows on the walls began to move, detaching themselves and writhing like living things. They slithered across the floor, converging on her. She fired the rifle, the deafening blast lighting up the room for a split second, but the shadows didn't stop. They crawled up her legs, her arms, cold and suffocating. And then, just as they reached her face, everything stopped. The shadows were gone. The whispers were silent. The lantern's glow returned to its steady warmth. But Lila wasn't in the cabin anymore. She stood in the clearing by the well, her rifle and lantern nowhere to be seen. The air was thick and heavy, the moon hanging low and blood red in the sky. Around her the forest pulsed with an unnatural energy, the trees swaying as if alive. And then she saw it. The well. But it wasn't just a crumbling ruin anymore. It was glowing, faintly, its edges humming with an eerie light. From its depths, the voice returned, not pleading this time, but triumphant. "You stayed too long." The ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The well's glow intensified, and from the darkness, shapes began to rise. Shadows, twisting and contorting, took form, humanoid but wrong, with elongated limbs and featureless faces. They surrounded her, cutting off any escape. Lila tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows closed in, their cold presence stealing her breath. And then, just as they reached her, she heard a final whisper in her ear. "You're one of us now." The cabin was quiet when the search party arrived 3 weeks later. They found the door locked from the inside, the lantern still burning on the counter. Lila was gone, but her rifle lay on the floor, its barrel bent at an impossible angle. Out in the woods, they found the well. It was just as the locals had described, old, crumbling, and dry as bone. But when one of the searchers peered inside, he swore he saw a faint, flickering light, and he swore he heard a voice, soft, distant, and familiar. "Help me. What happened to Lila?" You've probably heard about hikers disappearing in national parks, right? Some vanish without a trace, others are found miles from where they should be with no explanation for how they got there. It's unsettling, but usually dismissed as bad weather or poor preparation. But there's one story no ranger dares talk about, and once you hear it, you'll understand why. When I worked as a park ranger, I was stationed at Mount Echo National Forest, a sprawling wilderness famous for its rugged terrain and breathtaking vistas. But beneath the beauty was a reputation for strange occurrences. Hikers reporting eerie lights, disembodied voices, or a sense of being watched. The Rangers chalked it up to overactive imaginations. I did too, until I met the Bailey family. It was late October, a time when the forest takes on an eerie beauty. The leaves were fiery shades of orange and red, and the air was crisp with the first hints of winter. The Baileys, a father, mother, and their 10-year-old daughter Emma, had come to hike the Ridgeview Trail, a popular route known for its stunning views and relative safety. They signed in at the ranger station, cheerful and excited for their adventure. But when dusk fell, they hadn't returned. By nightfall, it was clear something was wrong. A search team was assembled. I volunteered to lead, partly because I knew the trail well and partly because something about the family's disappearance gnawed at me. Families rarely got lost on Ridgeview. It was a straightforward trail with clear markers. We set out with flashlights and radios calling their names into the darkness. Hours passed, and we found nothing. No footprints, no discarded belongings, no sign they'd ever been there. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Then, just after midnight, my radio crackled. "Unit 4, we've got a possible lead," came the voice of another ranger. "Northwest of Ridgeview, near the old logging road. Found something you need to see." The something turned out to be a backpack. It was Emma's. Her name was embroidered on the fabric. It was pristine, like it had been gently placed there. Nearby, we found a single shoe, also hers. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft, rustling sounds carried through the trees. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't random. It was a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakably a child's. "Help me!" The search party froze. We all heard it. One of the rangers muttered, "No way!" and refused to go any farther. I pressed on, flashlight cutting through the inky blackness. The voice grew louder, leading us deeper into the forest. "Help me!" We followed until we reached a clearing dominated by an ancient, gnarled tree. Its roots twisted into the ground like claws, and its trunk was marked with strange, looping symbols I'd never seen before. At its base was a hollow, a dark opening that looked like the mouth of the earth itself. The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't distant. It was right there. "Help me!" I dropped to my knees and shone my flashlight into the hollow. Inside was Emma. She was pale, her clothes torn and her eyes wide with terror. Relief flooded me, and I reached for her. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl deep in the hollow, so deep it seemed to come from the ground itself. Emma's face twisted in fear and she screamed, "Don't touch me! It's still here!" The growl grew louder, reverberating through the leery. "Sao, my." The rangers behind me shouted warnings, but I was fixated on Emma. I grabbed her hand and pulled her out just as the hollow seemed to collapse inward, the roots of the tree writhing like serpents. We ran, Emma clinging to me, her tiny frame trembling with every step. Behind us, the forest came alive with unnatural sounds, cracking branches, howling winds, and that terrible growling. It felt like the forest itself was trying to stop us. When we finally burst onto the Ridgeview Trail, the noises stopped. The forest was silent, deathly so. Emma sobbed into my shoulder as I radioed for help. Within minutes, other rangers arrived, their faces pale as they took in our disheveled states. Emma's parents were never found. Despite extensive searches, there was no trace of them, no evidence of what had happened. Emma wouldn't or couldn't say much. All we got from her were fragmented sentences about a dark place and the hollow. She begged us not to go back, her fear so raw it was contagious. As for the tree, when we returned to the clearing, it was gone. No roots, no symbols, no hollow, just undisturbed earth and an eerie stillness. Emma was eventually placed with relatives, and the forest was declared safe. But I knew better. I transferred out of Mount Echo not long after, unable to shake the feeling that the forest was watching, waiting. To this day, I can't look at trees without remembering that ancient, gnarled thing and the growl that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth. If you ever find yourself in Mount Echo National Forest, stick to the marked trails, and if you hear a voice calling for help, think twice before you follow it. Some things aren't meant to be found. You know those old motels you see along the highways? The ones with the peeling paint, flickering neon signs, and parking lots full of potholes. They're relics of a time when road trips were king, and everyone wanted to stay somewhere cozy and cheap. But some of those places have a past, a dark, festering past. And one of them is still open. In the fall of 2016, a man named Eric was driving cross-country for work. He was a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company and had spent the day visiting clients. Exhausted and unwilling to spend another minute on the road, he pulled off at a nondescript exit somewhere in the Midwest. The only place nearby was the Ridgeview Motel, a squat U-shaped building with a flickering neon vacancy sign. It was the kind of place you'd avoid if you had options. But Eric was tired, and the thought of driving another hour was unbearable. The lobby was musty, with an old bell on the counter and a faint smell of mildew in the air. An elderly man with cloudy eyes appeared from the back and wordlessly slid a key across the desk. The tag read, Room 6. "Just one night," Eric said. The old man didn't respond, just nodded once, and disappeared into the back room. Eric parked in front of Room 6, grabbed his overnight bag, and stepped inside. The room was exactly what he expected. Threadbare carpet, outdated wallpaper, a tiny TV on a rickety dresser. The only light came from a flickering overhead bulb. It wasn't great, but it would do. As he settled in, Eric noticed something odd. The room had a weird layout. On one wall, where there should have been space for a closet or a small kitchenette, there was only a blank stretch of wallpaper. It felt wrong, like the proportions were off. He tried not to think about it. He was just overtired. He showered, changed into sweats, and flopped onto the bed. The TV only got 2 channels, static and some old black and white movie. He turned it off and let the quiet of the room lull him to sleep. But then came the tapping. It started faintly, a soft tap, 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 like someone gently rapping on a window. Eric opened his eyes and glanced around. The room didn't have a window, just the door with its thin curtain. He got up, pulled it aside, and looked out. The parking lot was empty except for his car. "Must be the wind," he muttered and went back to bed. But the tapping continued. It was louder now, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Eric sat up, heart pounding. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the room. He scanned the walls, his eyes settling on that blank stretch of wallpaper. The tapping was coming from behind it. He approached cautiously, pressing his ear to the wall. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps, or something else. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No response. Eric grabbed his phone and dialed the front desk. It rang and rang, but no one answered. Frustrated, he decided to confront the old man in the lobby. He threw on his shoes and opened the door, but the night outside was eerily still. The lobby lights were off, and there was no sign of anyone. As he stood there, debating whether to leave, the tapping started again, louder this time. It was coming from the room, from the wall, and it wasn't alone. There were voices now, faint and muffled, like a crowd whispering just out of earshot. It was impossible to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, terrified. Eric's rational mind told him to get in his car and drive away, but curiosity, or stupidity, got the better of him. He stepped back into the room and approached the wall again. The whispers grew louder as he got closer, overlapping, until they became a cacophony. He ran his hands over the wallpaper, searching for some kind of seam. His fingers caught on a slight indentation, almost invisible in the dim light. It was a door frame, papered over to blend with the wall. Heart racing, Eric grabbed his pocket knife and began tearing at the wallpaper. The whispers turned into moans, rising in pitch and urgency. As the paper peeled away, a door emerged. A small, narrow door with a rusted handle. "Don't do it," Eric whispered to himself, but his hand was already reaching for the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black space beyond. Eric fumbled for his phone's flashlight and shone it inside. The beam illuminated a narrow hallway, its walls streaked with something dark and sticky. The air was heavy, damp, and reeked of decay. He should have left. He knew that. But something compelled him forward. The hallway led to another door, this one reinforced with steel bars. Behind it, Eric could hear movement, scraping, shuffling, and a low, guttural sound that sent chills down his spine. He shone his flashlight through the bars, and nearly dropped his phone. There were people inside. At least, they used to be people. Emaciated figures with pale, translucent skin and hollow eyes pressed themselves against the bars, reaching out with skeletal hands. They moaned and gnashed their teeth, their voices blending into a haunting wail. One of them looked directly at Eric and whispered, "Help us!" He stumbled back, tripping over his own feet, and turned to run. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, the whispers from the room now replaced by guttural growls. Shadows danced on the walls, moving closer, faster. He ran, the walls narrowing, the air growing thicker, until... Eric burst out of room 6, gasping for air. The parking lot was bathed in an unnatural light, and the flickering neon sign now read, "No escape." He jumped into his car and sped away, not stopping until he was miles from the motel. The next day, Eric returned with the local police, determined to find answers. But when they arrived, the Ridgeview Motel was gone. No building, no sign, not even a parking lot, just an overgrown field and a rusted "No Trespassing" sign. Eric still dreams about that night, about the tapping, the whispers, the hollow faces behind the bars, and sometimes, in the dead of night, he swears he hears them calling his name.